and to ask your question by pressing star 9. When it's your turn to ask your question, dial star 6 to unmute yourself. You can also join via Zoom video by going to ebiblefellowship.org and clicking the icon at the top. If you're calling in from another country, on our website, select the toll-free button at the top to find your country's number.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Open Forum program tonight. We're going to open up the phone lines to take your call, and each listener is invited to give us a call if you have a Bible question, and I'll try to answer by turning to the Bible and following the directions that God has given. When we purchase things in the world or seek to build something in the world, we first carefully read the directions. Well, God has given directions for the handling of His Word. And of course, if somebody wants to pick it up and read, there's nothing wrong with that. But as far as Bible study, the directions of God are these. You must compare spiritual with spiritual. That means we look at the words in the verse or passage we're studying and see where they're used elsewhere in the Bible. And we always do that. Then we must harmonize our conclusions, because when you do start to compare verses, you'll start to learn or you'll start to see certain information that comes forth, and it's coming forth from the Bible itself. And yet it's very possible that it's not correct. So God has given us a way of proving it, trying it, testing it, and that is to make sure it harmonizes, fits like a piece of a puzzle. It has to fit perfectly. When you're doing a puzzle, one of those more difficult ones in the Bible would be a more difficult one. The Bible's kind of like a million-piece puzzle. But when you're doing a difficult puzzle, you do not jam a piece into a spot. You may want it to fit in that spot, and if it just would fit in that spot, then you have a whole bunch of other pieces would come together, you think. And yet, if you start jamming a piece, well, you're starting to do wrong, and you'll never finish that puzzle. You'll never get it right. And so that's how it is with people who come to the Bible and they really enjoy the conclusion they came to. They love it. And got to watch out for pride when we're studying the Bible. It's a killer. And so because they came up with the idea, they discovered something, and they really like what they discovered, and yet it just won't fit with everything else, or even with one other thing in the Bible, yet they won't let it go. They won't let it go. They continue to insist, no, this is what the Bible says. And basically, that's every wrong church doctrine there's ever been. People can show those in the churches, well, you see, these verses won't allow for the conclusion of your confession or your creed or your church's position. Do they change? Oh, no, they're attached. They're in love with their doctrine. That's why they join that particular church, and they're not going to budge it. They're not going to move. Well, you see, the Bible tests us when we read it and study it. It is really God proving the individual. Are you going to be humble when you come to the Bible? The Bible, when we really dig into it and start studying it, is discovering the heart of the one. Well, excuse me, we just lost the computer over there. So I'll be right back. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure what it does to your screen. You may continue to see me, but I lose everything. So I have to do that. Okay, well, just talking about the Bible and the biblical hermeneutics, the direction God gives, comparing spiritual with spiritual, harmonizing all conclusions, and thirdly, looking for the deeper spiritual meaning. And those things do try the individual. They're testing. God is testing us. He's probing us when we come to the Bible. And our reaction to the Bible is a definite indicator of our heart condition. A proud heart gets nowhere in Bible study. God resists it. And the only way someone can have a humble heart is if they have a new heart, if they have a heart after Christ's own heart. And that's the reason why God knows, for example, as he has tried his people over these last decades of the Great Tribulation and now Judgment Day, and he's tried us through the revelation of his word, revealing truth, correcting doctrine, and so forth. But God knows his people will stay the course. His people will endure to the end. They will successfully go through this gauntlet of very severe testing of doctrines that try them because of their heart, not their intelligence, not their great wisdom, no, it's all based on their heart condition. The humble heart continues trusting the Lord, and they are approaching the Bible in a correct way, and so they will continue to go through each of these successive doctrinal tests and pass. But the proud heart, you can cling by flattery, you can hold on for a time, and yet at some point you will go back, you will fall away, and the information, the doctrinal truth you once knew will be taken from you. It'll be removed from you. That's one of the outworkings of Judgment Day. And the Bible tells us that it is God dealing with his servants when the man comes with the 1 pound and it's taken from him in the day of judgment and given to the one who had 10. God is increasing the wisdom and understanding and knowledge of his people. At the same time, he is taking away whatever these others seemingly once understood. They never truly understood it. It was only an appearance of understanding. And so this is the process that God is using. Okay, why don't we get started now by going to the first person on the phone tonight? Welcome to our new open forum program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Good evening. How are you? Um, can we look at Ezekiel 4:4-6?
Okay, Ezekiel chapter 4, starting in verse 4, it says, "Lie thou also upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it, according to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon it, thou shalt bear their iniquity. For I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days. So shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel."
Yeah. Can you explain these verses, please?
I'm sorry, I didn't read verse 6. "And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year." Well, yeah, it's very unusual that God would tell Ezekiel to do this, and yet he did. He commanded him to do this, and Ezekiel obeyed, and he laid on his left side, and this was to signify the iniquity of the house of Israel, according to the number of days they would bear their iniquity. And so verse 5 tells us, "I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days. So shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel." Okay, so a couple of times it speaks of the iniquity of the house of Israel. And the house of Israel, we know, well, it had its time in the Old Testament. They were God's people. And also, the churches and congregations are typified by the house of Israel. And the church was also God's people. So when we look for a starting point, we would look for some identification with Israel. And it so happens that Jacob had his name changed to Israel in the year 1907 BC, when he was 100 years old. Now, that would be literally the beginning of Israel. There was no Israel prior to 1907, because it was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. None of them were called Israel. But at that point, Israel had its beginning, we could say. And it so happens, if we start there with that year, 1907 BC, and go 390 years, because God speaks of 390 days, and then he says each day for a year. So the first thing we would check, let's go 390 years from 1907. And that brings us, now if we make an even 400, it'd just be easier to calculate. 1907 to 400 years would be 1507, but minus 10, because it's actually 390, would be 1517 BC. 1517 BC. Now, it's around the time that Moses or Aaron are being born, but no, with something like this, that would not be a significant enough event, and nothing else is really in view there. So we quickly realize it can't be 390 years, but maybe it could be 3,900 years. We add another 0. And we do that because it doesn't change the number really, or the meaning of the number spiritually. If you break down the number, it has the same components. And in this case, it would be 3 times 13. And that's interesting by itself, isn't it? 3 times 13, God's purpose, 13, the end of the world, and 10, the complete purpose of God for the end, or in this case, for Israel, as well as the church. If we go 3,900 years, it really covers both the nation of Israel's history and the history of the church age. And 1907 plus 3,900 years takes us to 1994. And 1994 was the official end of the church age. By that point, Israel, and by the way, did the nation of Israel have iniquity? They had a whole lot of iniquity. Did the churches and congregations have iniquity? Yes, they had a lot of iniquity too. Sinful doctrine, unfaithfulness, spiritual idolatry or fornication. And so God puts up with all the sins of the nation of Israel on one hand, and the New Testament churches and congregations for 3,900 years. And then finally in 1994, the official judgment on the church. He's no longer bearing their or putting up with their iniquity. Now he's judging them, and the church age is over. So the fact that it fits so well and comes to the point of the end of the church age, it lets us know it's correct. That's a correct understanding. We have the correct starting point, the correct time path. It landed on a very significant date in God's end time program, which we would expect. And by adding the other 0, the breakdown of the numbers basically remains the same. 3 times 13 times 10 times 10. It's just an additional emphasis on the number 10, completeness. This is you can be sure this is the complete end of the nation of Israel and the church they represented. So, but then God says to Ezekiel in verse 6, "And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year." Okay, now I'll just mention that what I just said about the 3,900 years, the starting point, the falling on the year 1994, that came from Mr. Camping. Mr. Camping wrote about that, I think, in the book 1994, and maybe in some of his other writings. And then when he came to the 40 days and the 40 years, what he did was he went back from 1907 to 2007 to the birth of Jacob, to the birth of Jacob and Esau. And I forget all the reasons for doing that, but one reason was it fit, because in his book 1994, he thought 1994 would be the end of the world. And therefore you could not have the conclusion could not go beyond the year 1994. And when you go 2007 BC to 1994, it totals 4,000 years. And so he thought this must be the conclusion. But this is a correction. This is a correction. You know, we are at a very advantageous position here, since we have now lived decades beyond 1994, and we can notice the careful wording. So first, God tells Ezekiel, lay upon your left side 390 days. And then in verse 6, and when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year. Okay. When you have accomplished 390, then you will turn to your right side and lie on that side for 40 days, and each day for a year. So it represents 40 years. Now, right away, we can see that the language seems to point to 390 plus 40, plus 40. And of course, historically, when Ezekiel did this, that's how it had to have worked out. He laid on his left side for a literal 390 days, and then he turned to his right side for a literal 40 days. The 40 days followed the 390. And the idea of taking that 40 days and going back to an earlier time from 1907 and 2007 does not seem to fit the biblical language. And more than that, it's very obvious when you add the two together, 390 plus 40, it totals 430. And 430 is a very significant Bible number, because that's the length of time that Israel would be in the land of Egypt, and to the self same day. Remember, God points that out, 430 years, the sojourning of the children of Israel in the land of Egypt was 430 years to the self same day. And here is 430 days when you add the two together. And again, that would indicate it must be consecutive, 390 plus 40 to get 430. And no going backwards with the numbers. That's not in view. That's not in view. Now, one other interesting thing, and I think important thing, Israel was delivered after 430 years. The timeline God is giving us in Ezekiel 4, when we work it out, and the 390 days works out to 3,900 years, and takes us to 1994. And then from 1994, what happens if we add 40? What happens if we add 40, not 40 days, 40 years? Now, someone might say, well, why 40 years? Why not 4,000 or 400? You didn't use the 390 for 390 years. Oh, but we tried. That's the first thing you would try. And then, due to the lack of any identification with key biblical events, we decided, no, it's not that. It's not that. And that's how you would work these things out. You trial and error. No, that won't fit. Let's go to the next option. Well, in this case, from 1994, we go a year for a day, 40 years, and it works out, doesn't it? Where does it take us? To the year 2033. 2033, which much biblical evidence is indicating will be the end of the world. And so This means that this timeline from Ezekiel 4 that directed us to 1907 when Jacob had his name changed to Israel, from 1907 all the way to 2033, it is 3,940 years, or 40 calendar years, 3,940 calendar years. And yet that's the equivalent of 430 days. And what happens again after 430? Deliverance. All Israel is delivered from Egypt. And after this 3,940 years passes, equivalent to 430 days, what are we looking forward to? What is our expectation of at the end of the world on the last day? We will be raised up. We'll be delivered from the world, which Egypt represents. And it'll be the great deliverance of God's elect, as it'll be the time of resurrection and rapture, and all will be translated. So now, if this were, excuse me, if this time path were alone, if it stood all by itself, then we would have we would say, well, this is interesting, very interesting, and it's a bit of evidence pointing to the year 2033, but it doesn't stand by itself. It doesn't stand by itself. The year 2033 is the 2000th year since Christ's death and resurrection. Exactly 2,000 years in 2033. The year 2033 is 7,023 calendar years from the flood. And that particular number of years is highly significant because it's been proven correct to reach the fullness of thousands of years, followed by 23 was proven correct with the flood after 6,023 years, and proven correct at the time of the cross after 5,023 calendar years from the flood. And so even going from the flood to the cross, proven correct. That is, the flood date with that timeline is proven to be a correct starting point for time pass going into the New Testament era. And from the flood to 2033, 4990 BC plus 2033, and you come to 7,023 calendar years. Major time pass. And now when following this passage in Ezekiel, it adds more weight. It is as these things like pieces of a puzzle. They're coming together, fitting, and we're not forcing anything. These things are fitting because we have a correct biblical calendar of history, and we're following the language. It was God who mentioned the house of Israel a couple of times in Ezekiel 4. And so there's no playing around, where we're doing something out of that is not correct or right to do. We're following the biblical allowance, and it just so happens to fit perfectly. But thank you for calling and sharing. And let's go now to the next person on the phone tonight. Welcome to our question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Yeah, I have a question about Satan before and after him being deposed. I find in my life that there's like wicked people, mostly on a criminal level, and they always seem to get away with what they're doing, like as if Satan is always helping them to never get caught. The police don't know these people. They never go to jail. And what I want to know, if that's true, if after he's deposed, if he's still able to protect wicked people.
Well, I think you may have a problem with overgeneralizing, because a couple of people. You can't project that and say, well, this is the case. There's an awful lot of people in jail who have done bad things. And we're living in a time where, more and more they want to let people out of jail, but still there's a lot of people who are suffering from punishment of earthly authorities under various governments. And we would have to say they're correctly being punished in most cases. And so Satan still exists, but he has been defeated. He's been put down. We know from the book of Esther, when Haman was hanged on the 17th day of the second month. We know from various other sources, or there's a reference. Let's see, a reference in Ezekiel 29, where God is speaking of Pharaoh. And he says in Ezekiel 29, verse 3, speak and say, thus saith the Lord Jehovah, behold, I am against thee, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lieth in the midst of his rivers, which has said, my river is mine own, and I have made it for myself. But I will put hooks in thy jaws, and will cause the fish of thy rivers to stick unto thy scales. And I will bring thee up out of the midst of thy rivers, and all the fish of thy rivers shall stick unto thy scales. And I will leave thee thrown into the wilderness, thee and all the fish of thy rivers. Thou shalt fall upon the open fields. Thou shalt not be brought together nor gathered. I have given thee for meat to the beasts of the field and to the fowls of the heaven. Now, this language, some of it matches Ezekiel 39 with Gog and Magog. Same kind of picture where they're thrown to the open fields and the fowls of the heaven feast upon them. And of course, that matches the language of Revelation 19, when the marriage supper of the Lamb, which is working out over the course of Judgment Day, and the fowls of the air are in view. But notice also Pharaoh is called the great dragon who lieth in the midst of his rivers. And God tells us in Isaiah 27 about the dragon, where we read in verse 1, in that day, Jehovah with his sore and great and strong sword, and that would be the word of God, the Bible, shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. In that day, it's Judgment Day, and Leviathan, who is called the serpent and dragon, so Leviathan's another name for Satan, will be slain by the word of God. And over in, I think it's Psalm 74, I hope it's that, Psalm 74, we read in verse 13, thou didst divide the sea by thy strength, thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters, thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Remember Ezekiel 29? Pharaoh, the dragon, God will take him out of the waters he calls his own, cast him into an open field, and all the fish of his rivers will stick to his scales. All the fish are all mankind, as fish represent men. And since it's all the fish of his rivers, it's all unsaved mankind cast out onto an open field to be meat for the fowls of the air. And this is telling us that God will break the heads of the dragons, plural, and breaketh the heads of Leviathan in pieces, because he's picking up the figure used in Revelation 17 of the 7 heads and 10 horns, but the 7 heads of Satan, the 7 mountains or kingdoms of Satan that the Lord uses as a figure of his rule over the earth since the fall of man back in the Garden of Eden, all the way to his reign over the nations and the church during the Great Tribulation. Well, once all the heads are broken, as it says there, again, thou breakest the heads of the dragons, thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces. No more rule. The head represents Satan's rule. God has broken the heads, every last one of them now, of Satan. He is not ruling. Get him out of your mind. He's not your problem. He's not your problem. God is mankind's problem. If anyone's unsaved, it's not Satan who's troubling them at this time in history. Well, yeah, maybe he can do a little something, but the big troubling is occurring because God is troubling the inhabitants of the earth. God is bringing that kind of torment throughout this prolonged judgment day period. This is the day of the wrath of God. It is the outpouring of his furious anger upon the sinners. This is the time of his vengeance. And every unsaved person is the target. The sinner who never became saved is the object of the wrath of God. And that is the reason that God is punishing people over the course of these days. But thank you for calling and sharing. And let's go now to the next person on the phone tonight. Welcome to our open forum program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Can you go to Genesis 39, verse 1?
Okay, Genesis 39, 1. And that says, and Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither.
I know you mentioned Potiphar as a picture of God the Father and Joseph, Christ, and Jesus. Who would then Pharaoh be a picture of here? Would that be Satan?
I'm sorry, who be a picture
Who would
of?
Pharaoh be a picture of here?
Well, Pharaoh, let's see, Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. This is not the same Pharaoh as will appear later in the account, who lifts Joseph out of prison. That Pharaoh is a great type of God. That's a good question.
I thought maybe Satan.
No, because Potiphar, who's a type and figure of God.
Right, that's what confused
And
me.
yeah, and so more than likely this Pharaoh would also be a figure of God. Now, this is the Pharaoh, the same Pharaoh who will eventually, throw the butler and baker into jail, and then will lift up the one and kill the other, execute the other. But yeah, I didn't really spend any time on that. I should have. So I want to look at that a little bit more before answering. Thank you for bringing that up. And by the way, in case there's listeners not following the study, and you are kind of shaking your head, how can Potiphar, this officer of Pharaoh, be a type and figure of God? Well, just keep in mind, if you read through the whole account, the relationship he has with Joseph is very positive. He sets Joseph over his own house and so forth, and then Potiphar's wife is key, because Potiphar's wife will reveal or really show us who Potiphar represents, and especially what she does to Joseph. But I guess I'll stop there, because we're going to get more into that, I think, in tomorrow's Bible study. But thank you for calling and sharing. And let's go now to the next person on the phone tonight. Welcome to our question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call. Hello? Hello, you may have to hit *6 to unmute yourself. *6.
Hey, Chris, how you doing tonight?
Oh, hello. I'm doing well, by God's grace. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, can we look at Judge chapter, I think Judge chapter 14 verse, I think Judge chapter 14 verses 8.
Judges 14:8. Let's go there. Okay, Judges 14 verse 8. And after a time,
I'm sorry, it's not that one. It's the one that says that I pray you to not drink strong drink. Is that verse? It's I think it's around that area, but I'm sorry, I don't have my Bible.
Okay, let's see. Might be the previous chapter where the angel of the Lord comes and tells them how to raise the child.
No, I think it's a little bit before that. The one that says like, I pray you, to not drink strong wine, and to
Well, yeah. Okay, let's see. Here God gives some, because Samson was to be a Nazarite from his womb. And so the angel of Jehovah, who was God himself, came and told them in how to raise the child. And let's see, where is that? I
think that's what, chapter 13 probably.
Well, yeah, I was
Verse
just
8.
looking there. I didn't see it. And that's when the account of Samson begins. Here in Judges 13, 7. But he said unto me, Behold, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and now drink no wine nor strong drink, neither eat any unclean thing, For the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death.
Now, my question to that is, what's the spiritual meaning there?
Well, a Nazarite, the word itself means to be separate. For example, if we go to Genesis 49, we read of Joseph in verse 26. The blessings of thy father have prevailed above the blessings of my progenitors unto the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him that was separate from his brethren. Well, the word separate is the word Nazarite. So Joseph was separate from his brethren, and in what way was he separate? Well, he was literally separated from them, as he was sold as a slave into Egypt, and not for many years were they reunited. And Joseph is a great type of Christ. Christ separate, to be separate often has to do with being set apart for service to God. And the people of God, the elect, we are chosen by God, separated out of the whole of mankind. There's billions and billions of people, and God, before the foundation of the world, he predestinated certain ones to obtain salvation. And by selecting these certain individuals, God separated us. And that's why when we read of Jeremiah, God tells us that I can't remember exactly how it goes. It's in Jeremiah chapter 1, where the Lord tells us in verse 5, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. That's before Jeremiah is born. And he would just be born a boy, a man child like anyone else, and his parents would raise him like they would any child. But at some point, God grabbed a hold of him, because God had chosen him to be an elect, first of all, but then to accomplish the will of God in his life. And it was a very difficult path for Jeremiah to be a prophet proclaiming the end of Judah, that God himself was judging his own people. And we can relate, can't we? It's not an easy thing to proclaim, and he suffered much, but he was separated for that purpose. Or the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 1 tells us the same thing, because this is true of all God's people. And Paul, the Bible tells us, is a pattern of the believer. He's a pattern of them that God has chosen to salvation. In Galatians 1, verse 15, but when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood, and so forth. But notice, God separated Paul, just as he did Jeremiah, from his mother's womb. And yet here was Paul, a Pharisee, a zealot, going about hailing men and women, throwing them into prison, persecuting the people of God, apparently as blind as the most ungodly people. And yet God had his eye on him the whole time. He is one of mine. I have separated him for a specific purpose. And yet God let his life work itself out in that manner. Why would God do that? Well, because Paul became, when he was not a true servant of the Lord, his heart was in an unsaved condition, yet he became very studious. He was raised with much instruction. He had much learning for a man of that time, and we see how God used that in moving Paul to write all the epistles that he did, and to and his life as a missionary and so forth. So God does not waste anything. We could be one of God's chosen, separated by God, and maybe even up until now, it hasn't worked itself out as yet in our life. But we still have a little time remaining, and God has revealed a plan to draw his people, to draw a great multitude. And that means all these souls of all that are part of that great multitude are going to come to the Bible. They're going to come to God, and God will have some of them do certain things to fulfill his will. They will be assigned tasks. God will give them those tasks. They have been separated unto those tasks. It's what God basically is saying in Ephesians chapter 2. In Ephesians 2, when he says, "For by grace are ye saved," and then in verse 10, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them." See, that's the same thing as Paul. That's the same thing as Jeremiah. Same thing as Joseph. God had Joseph go through all that misery and all that suffering in order to make a way for his people in Egypt. And it's just wonderful how God shows all things work together for good through the life of Joseph. And it really shows us when we read that statement in Romans 8 that it is a truth. All things work together for good. God has ordained us. He ordained Jeremiah to be a prophet. He ordained Paul to suffer great things for his name's sake. And Paul did, from being whipped five different times to being stoned and shipwrecked and so forth. He suffered greatly, and God has ordained us. He has prepared certain good works and ordained that we should walk in them. And to walk in the Bible means to keep his commandments, to perform the doing of something. It's not enough just to that's the church idea of being a Christian. I'm a Christian if anyone asks, and I attend church. I'm a member or whatever. There is no more church, first of all, and it's not enough just to be someone that God has saved. As far as if we're still living in this world, well, what's your purpose? What's your purpose? Is it to go to work and make money and raise your family? Well, what are you going to do with that money or even your family? How much time is left? Look at the world. Everything's fallen apart. It's the time of the final judgment of God. And God gives us a purpose in his word. He tells us what to do regarding feed his sheep. And yeah, we have certain purposes within family and with work. If you work heartily as to the Lord and not to men. Love your wives if you're a husband, obey or submit to your husbands if you're a wife, honor your parents if you're children. But there's more than that. When God has separated us and ordained us to walk in certain good works, there's more than that. And I don't know what it is for each person, it's something the Lord will reveal to us, and we have to discover as we go along, but we have to be, willing, and God will make us willing and desirous to do his will. And if he directs us in a certain way. But thank you for calling and sharing. And let's go now to the next person on the phone tonight. Welcome to our program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hey, Chris, can you read 1 Chronicles 21 verses 1?
1 Chronicles 21:1. Excuse me. And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel.
I think it was yesterday a caller had called in about, he had a question about, can Satan stir up a believer to do something evil? And is this, can you explain this, what this means? How exactly did Satan provoke David? Did he use other men around him, unsaved men, to provoke him to number rather than directly?
This isn't as easy as to understand as we might think. Because it was, from what we can read, it was David's idea to number Israel. And yet there's been other numberings in the Bible. So that in itself does not appear to be sinful. Of course, it would depend on, there could be an element of pride, but what stands out, if we go to 1 Chronicles 20, I think it's 1 Chronicles 27. Oh, I maybe won't be able to find this. It's been a while. 1 Chronicles. Yeah, I'm not seeing it here. Oh, here it is, 1 Chronicles 27. And we read in verse 23. And this is additional information about the numbering of Israel. But David took not the number of them from 20 years old and under, because Jehovah had said he would increase Israel like to the stars of the heavens. Okay, so that means when David sent Joab to number Israel, he was supposed to number all the males over the age of 20 and not number any males under the age of 20. And then it goes on to say in verse 24, Joab, the son of Zeruiah, began to number, but he finished not, because there fell wrath for it against Israel, neither was the number put in the account of the Chronicles of King David. And when you look at the two accounts, there's one in Samuel and one in Chronicles, there's a difference in the numbers. And that's because when it says Joab began to number, but he finished not, what God means is he began to number those under 20. He began to number, I think it was of Judah, as in one account, I think there's 30,000 less. And as neither was the number put in the account of the Chronicles of King David. So in Chronicles, you'll find a lesser number of people or of these men, because Joab was numbering incorrectly. Joab was doing something that was not to be done by numbering teenagers. Maybe, you can have a nice, strong looking young man, 17, 18, 19 years old. And there were already tensions between Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And Joab was identified with David and the nation of Judah. And he certainly noticed that there were many more men in the north. They numbered over 1 million. And so, wanting the south, Judah, to have a bigger army, he started numbering some of these younger men, which was against the commandments of the Lord. And that's when wrath fell. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, began to number, but he finished not, because there fell wrath for it against Israel, and neither was the number put in the account of the Chronicles of King David. So that helps us to explain, what the reason why God's wrath fell. It wasn't so much the numbering, but numbering incorrectly. Just in a similar way, the wrath that fell upon Pharez at that place called Pharez Uzzah. It wasn't because they were trying to move the ark, but they were moving the ark in an incorrect manner. They didn't have the Levites. And so God struck Pharez dead. I think his name was Pharez. And so Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. If we go to 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, it says, and again, the anger of Jehovah was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go, number Israel and Judah. So in other words, God knows everything that's going to happen. And so the Lord puts it in David's mind, not Satan, but the Lord puts it in David's mind to number Israel. And again, that in itself is not sinful. Joab doesn't like it from the start, and yet he goes about doing it. But Joab commits the sin, and Joab was an unsaved man, and so the Lord would have allowed Satan to perhaps be to influence Joab to do this thing of numbering the younger men, and yet it accomplishes God's purpose of where the Lord is already angered, or the anger of Jehovah was kindled against Israel before anything happened at all, because of the sins of the natural men within the nation, and their tendency towards idolatry and being unfaithful, failing to keep the commandments of God. So it's a pretty complex thing, but it would not have been Satan doing anything directly to David. he would have worked through Joab and all at the allowance of God to accomplish God's purpose of pouring out his judgment. But
I
thank
see,
you.
okay. Thank you.
Thank you for calling and sharing. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight and sharing your questions and comments, and especially the Bible verses we had a chance to read and consider. We have come to the end of our time, Lord. Open forum program tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern, and we hope you can join us then. But for now, may you have a good night, and may the Lord's perfect will be done.
Thanks again for joining us for eBible Fellowship's live open forum program. We invite you to call us with your Bible questions Monday through Friday evenings beginning at 9 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for being with us. Have a blessed evening.